Okay, if you need an extra drink of tea, one of them today, the one with the tea bags in it, is actually some tea that Rose Gallagher gave me. I think it's apple cinnamon something. Festival or fiesta, I was going to say. We've actually started drinking more tea too. Usually now we have to fill up a third jug. So sometimes Deacon's done it, or sometimes I've gotten to it. This is good. So today I think, did we start talking about this first section, the king enters his city? I think we mentioned just a few things, so we'll kind of start there. And one of them is to note the major transition that happens at the beginning of chapter 11. The scriptures feel different and they talk differently about the life of Jesus. What is so different about it?
He's older. He's not telling people, like, don't talk about, or don't go home and be silent.
Right. So Jesus is being much bolder. He is taking much more initiative. He's directing things. What else? What kinds of things have we gotten used to hearing? Parables, and probably one more thing. Things that Jesus does. Miracle stories, right? Here, there's very few miracle stories. You also, the more that we dive into this time period in Jesus' life, the more you feel like it starts narrating days. It doesn't tell us everything that happened in a day, but think about this, because sometimes it says, like, Jesus traveled around to the synagogues of Galilee and was preaching and teaching, right? And we talked before about how that takes an amount of time, because walking from one town to another is sometimes the journey of a day. And if he's traveling around Galilee, like, that's a line that describes maybe a month or 2 months of the activity in the life of Jesus. Now you have a series of stories that kind of come one after the other. The timeline is much more condensed. They're leaving out fewer things. Things and tensions are drawing to a high point. And so this is another thing that I think, as you read the scriptures, these are good to notice. Like, this is a major literary transition. And you should know, how many verses are there in the text of the scriptures? Think sideways. None. Those are all added. And they're relatively modern. In fact, most of the text of the New Testament, the ancient manuscripts, don't even have spaces between words. And they don't have capital letters and small letters. Part of the invention of capital letters and small letters happened in the 800s with a manuscript called Carolingian Minuscule. That's hundreds of years later. There's no chapters in the Bible. They're not real. Now, they're not bad, and they're helpful, and they were added to help people be able to locate things more easily. But it is good not to forget this. It's actually why someday what I'm hoping to get, sometimes when they publish Bibles, instead of putting the little verse numbers in everywhere, they put them on, like, the side of a column. So it's harder to tell exactly where a verse begins, but you actually get to read the text as it's given, instead of getting so distracted by all of these things that are added to it. Because there's no verse numbers. Those, I think, what were they in? I don't know when verse numbers were added. Chapter numbers are older. I think chapter numbers are over 1,000 years old. But the verse numbers are more modern. I wonder if they're in like the 1500s in the advent of printed Bibles.
So, but were all the books still separate? Like the Septuagint, or was it divided into Genesis?
Oh yeah, yep. The books were separate, and for much of history, like the Jewish people wrote in columns on scrolls. The Christians switched and changed to book bindings and binded them all on one end, the same end, and then you had pages. But yeah, the books were divided, and very often you have to remember that books weren't collected as often. We live in a world also marked by one profound invention, which is probably one of the most important ones in history, the printing press. Because before that, writing and typing was much more precious, much harder to do. You couldn't mass produce things very easily. Some of the monks they would have these rooms called the scriptorium, and they might have 10 or 15 monks that were working in copies of scriptures at the same time. But a copy of the Bible took 20 years to write. So there are many things, but it is important as we dive into the text just to keep that in your mind, that the verses are helpful, but they're not real. And just because it's divided there doesn't mean that the division is necessary. And that's why sometimes, like you've noticed in the chapters in the book, they go to the middle of one chapter and then they start. And like, even though it's in like the middle of chapter 10, it actually starts kind of a different frame of reference. And it's because of this, because the people that divided the scriptures did a fairly good job for the most part of finding some natural divisions of where to put chapters, but it's arbitrary. You could get a group of scholars together and say, we're re-chaptering the Bible and go through the whole thing and move all of the chapters around to better accommodate the text and break it up less. That would cause fits for scholars and they would not like you. And it's to the point now where it's like, even scholars that would suggest that it's not all perfect don't really talk about changing it, as far as I know, because it's just so widely accepted that it's become a useful reference system, where if you change it all, then all of the reference system breaks down. So Jesus comes into Jerusalem from the east. What is east of Jerusalem? Some of you have been there. You should know this. The Mount of Olives. There's a bunch of modern day cemeteries on the Mount of Olives. You know why? Because it's the place where the Messiah is supposed to enter the temple. So all of the people there want to be raised from the dead first. Because that's where the Messiah, that's this kind of Jewish tradition. The Christians and the New Testament would say it doesn't really matter where you are. When it's the end of the world, you'll know. There will be no secret, sneaking in the middle of the night. It will be a big bang and a flash of light or something. The scriptures describe it as trumpets. They also describe the eruption of Mount Sinai and God breaking a mountain as trumpets. So the trumpets that they're talking about aren't gentle, nice trumpets. I think from Franz Telemann that you can listen to. He's a good composer. So Jesus is going up to the temple, and it's worth getting an image of what this is like in our mind. What would you notice about the temple in ancient Jerusalem? What do you think? It's huge. Remember that most people's homes are very, very small compared to modern day thinking. Like Holy Spirit in our complex here would be probably bigger than any enormous palace in the ancient world. You've never thought of our church as a palace, but if it were in ancient Jerusalem, we would probably be, right? So it's big. What else? It's what?
Divided into sections.
Jerusalem was divided into sections and the temple has sections, but you probably wouldn't see that quite as much when you're walking up to it. You're going uphill. Yep, it's on the top of a hill. It was very tall. The Herodian temple that Jesus would have seen was one of the tallest things in the ancient world, certainly in ancient Jerusalem. It's about 100 feet tall. And it was white. It was done in this like beautiful, expensive white stone. Herod expanded the courtyard of the temple to rather large dimensions. It occupies what is most likely the modern day Temple Mount, although there's some possibility that part of the Temple Mount got wrecked. Because Jesus has this curious phrase. He says, not one stone will remain upon another. And very obviously, the Temple Mount is left and the Dome of the Rock is on top of it today. So there's some things like that. But anyway, so the temple is big, it's huge. There's a gate to the east, and then there's several other gates. The temple was built by, the first temple was built by who? Solomon. Who got all the stuff for it, though? David. The only reason David didn't build it is because God told him not to. Otherwise, David would have. That temple that Solomon built was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. So a little bit, well, close to 600 years before the time frame that we're talking about. And then it was rebuilt after the exiles' return by, anyone remember? Herod begins, he expands it and he makes it nicer, but he started with something that was built before him. Ooh, this is a good Deacon question. Does Deacon know?
Cyrus.
Cyrus the Great, you're on the right track. Cyrus the Persian, he sends them with money to do it, but he's not the one who does it. There's a guy in the Old Testament that shows up in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah named Zerubbabel. And he shows up. He shows up in the line of the Messiah. If you listen at Christmas time, when we read the gospel, it talks about like, so is Abraham, the father of Isaac, the father of Jacob, the father of da-da-da-da-da. Zerubbabel is in there. He's the one who rebuilt the temple. He was in charge of it. And I think Nehemiah, I think. Ezra was the priest, and I think he did the restoration of the law. But anyway, that was completed. That was worked on in the 400s BC. So it had been standing for several hundred years. Herod rebuilds the temple. Why do you think Herod rebuilds the temple? You're right. He has a lot to atone for. The people are angry and upset because he's been a jerk. And so to make the people happy, he works on the temple. And so they're doing construction on the temple. And you guys might know that in the modern world, we're not very patient constructors. Because remember that time in the life of Jesus when it talks about like this temple has been under construction for, what do they say, 46 years? And you're going to destroy it in 3 days? They're like, good luck. I mean, some of them are 80-ton blocks of stone. You don't move 80 tons very easily, do you? How many of you have tried to do that? So the temple is big. It is on the Temple Mount. It's a place of sacrifice. There was a stream that flowed out from under the Temple Mount. The water was considered very precious because it was mingled with the blood of all of the sacrifices. To me, that sounds kind of creepy, but it's relatively rich water. And that shows up in a bunch of places in the New Testament and the Old Testament. I saw water flowing from the temple's right side is the refrain that is supposed to be connected with the sprinkling rite at Mass because it connects with Jesus on the cross. how does it connect to him? He was stabbed by a spear on the right side, and out came blood and water, an image of the temple of his body. The river flowing out of the temple also shows up in the book of Ezekiel, the story of the man who's asked to wade into the water, and it's like waist deep and knee deep and ankle deep, and pretty soon he's drowning. And it flows out upon the eastern districts. Where are the eastern districts? Where? A little bit past there. You remember, it makes the salty water sweet. It flows into the Dead Sea and the desert blooms. That's the image that the scriptures use. Remember the Judean wilderness where Jesus is tempted, where John the Baptist lives? This is all right in that same road, like drawing a line east from Jerusalem toward the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. So it makes the salt water fresh. The same image shows up in the book of Revelation at the end of the Bible about the river of life watering the gardens of God, and the plants are blossoming. So my point in talking about this is you have to think about the geography and how this is all tied together. Because when you start to see it, like these are probably the kinds of things that Jesus is thinking about walking up to the temple. They're probably praying psalms. They're coming in from the east. Bethany and the Mount of Olives are there. But just past the Mount of Olives begins the Judean wilderness and the desert, and it dries out. The areas closer to the city on the highlands are still a little bit wet and get some rain, but it dries out very, very quickly and becomes almost uninhabitable. There were wide open courtyards. Few people actually go into the temple itself. Who goes into the temple itself? Only the priests, and only when they're performing the services of the day. Even for a priest, they can't go into the temple whenever they want. They only go into the temple when they're performing a service. One of these is very, very important for the New Testament. There's a priest that goes into the temple, Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, and he goes in to do what? He goes in to burn incense at the time of the evening sacrifice. So in the evening and the morning were the only two times of day that people went into the temple. What else would you see? What are some of the parts of the temple that it has? There's courtyards, yep. In front of it, where the sacrifices are offered, there's a giant altar. It's 30 feet tall and about 15 feet square, I think, around the top, where there was always fire burning, so it would smell like roasted meat, because they were offering the sacrifices there. It would probably also smell like incense and baking bread and all sorts of other things, because that's what they were offering in sacrifice on the altar. There was a giant basin called the sea. There were also menorah, or menorot would be the plural, where these giant 7-branch candlesticks. In the temple, there's 7 branches, because 7 is the number of perfection. 8-branch candlesticks come from a different thing, the 8 days of the Feast of Purification, Purim. I think there's a time where the oil lasts for 8 days until they can make new ones, and that's what they celebrate. So the menorah that many Jewish people have near Christmas time are 8 branches, but the ones in the temple are 7. There's also the bread of the presence. And the Ark of the Covenant was not there in the time of Jesus. The ark disappeared. The prophet Jeremiah hid it, and it was gone. At least that's the Jewish tradition, is that it was hidden and not taken by the Babylonians. So in the center of the temple is, or in the Holy of Holies is what? Nope, it's not there. Jeremiah hid it somewhere else. So what do they have in it in the time of Jesus? What? No ark. The ark is gone. They have a bare rock. They call it the foundation stone of the world, the first place that creation began, but it's a bare rock. So my point in describing the temple in this way is it's good for us to picture it, to feel a little bit like what it would be like. If you watch some of the shows, like it shows up in The Chosen a little bit, it shows up in some other ones, you can see them kind of walking up to the temple and how much taller it is than everything else. That is important. I think it shows up a little bit in The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson. So Jesus comes into the temple. He is riding on a donkey. He's coming from Bethany. Lazarus was just raised from the dead. The people welcome him as the Messiah, as the Son of David. Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The New American Bible does something silly here. It changes Lord to Master, and that's silly, because Lord is the word that's used, kurios, which can mean master, but we've talked again and again how the Lord is also the divine name, the name of God that's given at the burning bush in Mount Sinai. Jesus accepts the acclaim of the people now. We mentioned that he is receiving what they're saying. He doesn't reject it. He doesn't hide from it. He doesn't tell them not to talk about it. He accepts it. This is his time and his hour. So he comes into the temple. And the temple is a physical building, but in the scriptures, it's also important to remember that it's playing with meaning. The true temple, in a sense, is Jesus Christ himself and his body. The New Testament describes Christians as being temples of the Holy Spirit. The temple of Jewish life, you could say, the temple of the sacrificial system. All of these meanings are kind of blended together. That's a good place for fruitful reflection. Like if Jesus comes to your temple, what does he find? Where would you end up in the story? So then this poor fig tree, I always feel bad for the fig tree. Like, what did the fig tree do? It was growing by the side of the road and it's not time for figs, and Jesus curses it. Now, part of what's happening here is that there's this theme running in the background that God came to the temple looking for fruit. The fruit of righteousness, the fruit of holiness, the fruit of the covenant. That Israel is like a tenant who's in the vineyard of the master, and the master sending servants back to look for the fruit. And they're not finding any. This is the gospel we heard this weekend, and it actually fits perfectly because it's what the story is about. So he sends the prophets to look for fruit. They're not finding any. He sends his son, and the tenants in the vineyard who are wicked say, we'll kill the son and inherit the vineyard. And Jesus says, no, the master will throw out the tenants and get new ones who will produce fruit at the proper time. So that's part of what's happening here. So he goes into the temple, and what does he find? Money changers, not so much gambling. This is one of the places where we have to be careful of how we apply stereotypes and mudslinging, because it happens in this story all the time. And one of the things that I found really revolutionary and important is that you have to try and see this in the light of what's happening. Because it's easy to say that it's gambling, and maybe some of them were, and maybe some of them were dishonest, and that's evil and wicked. But Jesus is concerned not just about the evil and the wickedness, but about taking space in the temple at all for these economic activities. Why? Because it's supposed to be a place of prayer for all nations. Nations is an important word here too, because who are the people of the nations? The Gentiles. It actually tells you exactly where this is happening, in the courtyard of the Gentiles. There's people trading money. Now, why are they trading money? What is going on? To pay temple tax, that's a divine duty though. You have a duty from God and a responsibility from God himself to pay the temple tax. So you're right, to pay the temple tax. Why do they have to change money to pay the temple tax? Why does it have to be paid in shekels? No. You're on the right track, but no. It's because on most of the money of the world were stamped images of pagan gods, or the head of a Roman emperor. But the inscription around the Roman emperor said Tiberius Caesar Augustus Dei Filius, the Son of God. So the Jews say, you can't pay the temple tax with pagan money. Like, we can't use money that worships pagan deities or worships the emperor to pay for things of God. So that's part of it. Why else would there be like money changers and people selling animals? For sacrifices. Why would they be selling animals? Someday try and bring a goat. I guarantee you at some point you will either have roasted goat or dead goat, right? So if you're traveling, let's say, from get to Jerusalem, people in the temple are providing an important service. They're doing something. Jesus doesn't critique them for what they're doing. He doesn't